On a humid evening in Newport, 15th August 1893, the mirrored ballroom of Marble House glows under electric chandeliers, their light spilling across parquet floors designed for waltzes that have not yet begun. At the far end of the room, 16-year-old Consuelo Vanderbilt, born in New York on 2nd March 1877, lifts her chin a fraction as her mother watches from a gilded chair. Her white kid gloves are already flawless, but the governess smooths them again, drawing the buttons tight at the wrist, a small ritual that hides a larger purpose. Behind the girl's straight back lies the memory of the steel brace she has worn for years, fastened from waist to forehead to perfect her posture during lessons. On a side table rests a photograph just arrived from London, a duchess in court dress, captioned in an illustrated paper, a model of what an American heiress might become. Nearby, in a notebook begun that summer, Consuelo will later write that she felt herself being prepared as a finished specimen framed in a perfect setting. The orchestra is silent. She adjusts her gloves once more, not for comfort, but because there is nothing else she is allowed to move. On a cold morning in New York City in January 1884, carriage wheels grind over the snow along Fifth Avenue as 7-year-old Consuelo Vanderbilt is led down the marble staircase of the Vanderbilt Mansion at 1660 Fifth Avenue. Her parents, William Kissam Vanderbilt, heir to a railroad fortune valued at over $200 million, and Alva Vanderbilt, Southern-born daughter of a mobile cotton broker, have already secured their place in New York society through Alva's famous costume ball of 6 in March 1883. An event that forced even Caroline Astor to acknowledge the family's arrival. In the third-floor schoolroom, a governess straightens the child's sash, tugs gently at her tiny gloves, and begins the day's routine, reading from illustrated primers, French vocabulary drilled through repetition, and careful posture maintained at a small mahogany desk positioned to catch northern light. The room smells of beeswax and lavender sachets. Outside, the city rumbles with the sound of construction, more mansions rising, more fortunes declaring themselves in limestone and marble. Later memoirs and biographical studies note that Alva viewed her only daughter as the culmination of her own thwarted ambitions. Having clawed her way into society through strategic marriages and calculated entertaining, Alva intended Consuelo to occupy the heights she herself could never reach. A European title, a historic estate, entry into courts where American wealth alone could not penetrate. The discipline began early. "My mother was a genius," Consuelo would later write with careful ambiguity. She had imagination and daring. The house itself, one of the great chateaux of what newspapers called Millionaire's Row, embodies the logic of her upbringing. Vast ballrooms for 500 guests stand ready for entertainments that last until dawn. Servants' corridors run hidden behind silk-paneled walls. The nursery occupies a remote wing where even laughter is expected to remain decorously muted. In this architecture, every room teaches its lesson. Display is purposeful, privacy is scarce, and a daughter's body belongs to the family's larger designs. On her 8th birthday, Consuelo receives not toys but a child-sized writing desk with monogram stationery. The gift arrives with instructions. She is to practice her penmanship daily, copying passages from French novels her mother selects. At night, after her governess has left, she sometimes runs her small fingers over the smooth kid leather of her evening gloves, laid out for the next day's lessons. They fit perfectly, designed to shape her hands into the proper form even as they grow. The gloves are small, but the expectations stitched into them are already larger than the child who wears them. And the ballroom waits, somewhere ahead, its mirrored walls reflecting a future she cannot yet imagine. By spring 1892, when Marble House was completed in Newport as Alva's $11 million answer to Caroline Astor's Beechwood, Consuelo was 15. The house, designed by Richard Morris Hunt and built between 1888 and 1892, rises on Bellevue Avenue like a Loire Valley chateau transplanted to American shores. Its 500,000 cubic feet of white marble, sourced from quarries as far as Africa and Italy, arrives by ship and rail, then is carved and polished by craftsmen imported from Europe. Newspapers marvel at the Gothic ballroom, the gold room modeled after Versailles, and the Chinese tea house perched above the cliffs. But Consuelo's own quarters tell a different story. In later recollections published in The Glitter and the Gold, she describes her bedroom as austere to the point of severity. Dark oak paneling, narrow windows overlooking the service courtyard rather than the sea, and furniture chosen entirely by her mother. I would not have dared to put away my own possessions, she writes. Personal items, a few books, a pressed flower from a rare afternoon of freedom, are kept hidden in a locked drawer. On her writing table lie neatly arranged pens and journals she has been instructed to use for correspondence and diary entries that her mother periodically reviews. The decor is deliberate. Alva believes that comfort breeds softness, that luxury must be earned through perfect deportment. The girl's room is designed not for rest, but for discipline, a private training ground where even solitude is supervised. Downstairs, the great ballroom serves a dual purpose. It dazzles Newport society and functions as Consuelo's rehearsal space. On afternoons when no guests are expected, a music master hired from New York arranges himself at the Steinway grand piano and plays waltzes at half tempo while Consuelo practices her steps. A maid stands ready with a fresh pair of gloves if the first shows any hint of wear or moisture. The girl's reflection multiplies in the mirrored walls. Not a child at play, but a specimen being prepared for exhibition. The sessions can last 2 hours. Forward, side, close, back, side, close. The music master corrects her weight distribution, the angle of her arms, the precise tilt of her chin. You must appear to float, he instructs in accented English. The illusion is that you have no body at all, only grace. When she stumbles, the lesson begins again. The July heat presses against the tall windows, but the curtains remain closed to protect the mirrors from sunlight. Inside, the air grows thick with the scent of her perspiration and the faint metallic tang of the brass chandelier fixtures. Outside, society columns report on the Vanderbilts' new cottage with breathless admiration. Inside, the most carefully controlled space is not the ballroom itself, but the young woman being trained to move within it without leaving a trace of her own will. On a gray weekday in New York, circa 1890, lessons at the Fifth Avenue mansion begin not with a book but with an apparatus. As Consuelo later writes in The Glitter and the Gold, her memoir published in 1952, a horrible instrument was devised to improve my deportment. A steel rod strapped along her spine from waist to neck with a band that crossed her forehead, worn during hours of study. The contraption prevented her from slumping, from turning her head, from any movement that might compromise the ramrod posture expected of a future duchess. The governess adjusts Consuelo's gloves after the brace is fastened. The girl must hold her book high, elbows away from her body, maintaining the lines that will define her ballroom silhouette. Her arms ache within minutes. By the end of an hour, her shoulders burn. But complaining is unthinkable. My mother's belief in rigid discipline was absolute, Consuelo recalls. She was convinced that only through suffering could one achieve perfection. Outside on Fifth Avenue, carriages rattle past bearing other wealthy children to Central Park or afternoon teas. Inside, even a shift of weight is noticed and corrected. The steel presses against her vertebrae. The forehead band leaves a faint red mark that takes hours to fade. In the evening, her maid applies cold compresses, but no one speaks of the device. It is simply part of the training, like French verbs or piano scales. This discipline has its literature. Posture manuals and dancing treatises of the 1880s and 1890s emphasize that grace begins with the ability to sustain perfect carriage without visible effort. Alan Dodworth, the era's most influential dancing master, writes in his widely consulted guide that the first requisite is a good position, and that the body should be so trained that to stand or sit erect will be the natural and easy position. The training, he suggests, must begin in childhood before bad habits calcify. But Dodworth writes for dancing schools and polite society, for families. Like the Vanderbilts, whose daughters are being groomed not merely for New York ballrooms, but for presentation at European courts. The standards are more exacting. The girl who will one day curtsy before Queen Victoria must do so with a posture that appears effortless, which means the effort must be invested years in advance, through methods that leave no room for weakness. Dance, Consuelo learns, is not yet steps. It is stillness first, the capacity to hold oneself upright without fidgeting, without sagging, without betraying any hint of physical need. Her body becomes an instrument to be tuned, a material to be shaped. She is 11 years old. The steel rod is eventually retired, but by then it has done its work. Her posture remains flawless even without mechanical enforcement. Before she's taught to move beautifully, she is taught not to move at all. An early lesson in how Gilded Age elegance often begins with constraint that becomes second nature. By the early 1890s, American heiresses like Consuelo stood at the intersection of industrial fortunes and European aristocratic needs. Between 1870 and 1914, an estimated 454 American women married into European nobility, with roughly 100 of these unions involving British peers. The phenomenon was sufficiently common that newspapers coined a term for it: dollar princesses, young women whose dowries of railroad stock, mining shares, and real estate rescued debt-burdened estates from collapse. The exchange was blunt in its arithmetic. British estates like Blenheim Palace, ancestral seat of the Dukes of Marlborough, required tens of thousands of pounds annually for maintenance. Funds that agricultural depression and entail laws made increasingly difficult to secure. American fortunes, by contrast, were liquid, vast, and unencumbered by tradition. A strategic marriage could save an estate, restore a family name, and secure a lineage. In return, American families acquired the one commodity their wealth could not directly purchase: a place in the ancient hierarchies of Europe. The training these young women received, in dance, languages, deportment, and the intricate codes of aristocratic behavior, functioned as preparation not only for New York ballrooms, but for future roles as hostesses, charity patrons, and informal diplomats in London drawing rooms and country houses abroad. A perfectly executed waltz, a flawless curtsy, the ability to converse in French with a visiting duchess, these were not mere social graces, but negotiable assets in a marketplace where bloodlines and bank accounts were openly traded. In this world, the waltz step was both art and currency, and a girl's body was the vessel through which family ambition moved into history. In New York, winter 1891, the schoolroom day at 265th Avenue now runs on a schedule as precise as railroad timetables. French at 9 o'clock, conducted by a Parisian tutor who corrects every mispronounced liaison. German at 10 in CDM, preparation for conversations with visiting European nobility. History after luncheon, focusing on British peerage, European dynasties, and the genealogies Consuelo will need to navigate with ease. Piano before dinner, emphasizing pieces suitable for afternoon musicals. Between these formal lessons, there are sessions in watercolor painting, needlework, and the arrangement of flowers, accomplishments that signal cultivation without suggesting professional ambition. Biographical studies of the Vanderbilt family, drawing on letters and household records, describe this period as one of relentless oversight. Alva personally reviews Consuelo's progress, dismissing tutors who fail to produce results and adding new subjects when she judges her daughter's education incomplete. There are no idle hours. Even leisure is structured: supervised walks in Central Park, carefully selected books, attendance at approved concerts and lectures. The goal is not knowledge for its own sake, but the creation of a woman who can hold her own in any aristocratic setting without embarrassing her family or revealing the commercial origins of her wealth. Dance is folded into this regime, though records do not preserve the names of every instructor. Contemporary accounts and society columns reveal that elite New York families routinely employed professional dancing masters. Chief among them, Allen Dodworth, whose academy on Fifth Avenue trained generations of the city's children in waltz, quadrille, cotillion, and the newly fashionable two-step. Dodworth's methods emphasized not only technical proficiency, but moral development. Dancing, he wrote, is more than steps. It is a school of manners, a training in courtesy, a discipline of the body that refines the spirit. In a quiet parlor of the Vanderbilt mansion, a tutor whose name has not survived in family records marks time with a silver-handled walking stick while Consuelo practices simple waltz sequences. 3 soft steps forward, 3 gliding back, her eyes fixed just above her partner's shoulder as she has been instructed. The governess occasionally assumes the role of partner, one hand at Consuelo's waist, the other holding her gloved hand at the prescribed height. When Consuelo falters, a misstep, a glance downward, a momentary loss of the rhythm, she looks down at her gloves, a small private reset, and begins again. The repetition is deliberate. Grace, she is learning, is not inspiration but habit, the accumulation of 10,000 correct movements until the body performs them without conscious thought. The waltz, in this understanding, is not self-expression, but a standardized form, a social technology for moving through space in ways that declare one's class, breeding, and suitability for elevated company. By the end of an afternoon session, Consuelo's feet ache in their narrow kid slippers. Her arms are tired from holding the position, but complaining would be futile, and worse, unfeminine. A lady does not acknowledge physical discomfort. She certainly does not allow it to disrupt her performance. These too are lessons, absorbed through repetition until they become reflexive. Grace is no longer just posture. It is time, counted and drilled, preparing her to move precisely when society calls her name, and to move in ways that leave no doubt she has been trained for exactly this. On an afternoon in New York, spring 1893, a well-thumbed copy of Alan Dodworth's Dancing and Its Relations to Education and Social Life lies open on a side table in the Vanderbilt Library. The book, published in multiple editions and widely consulted by the families who hired Dodworth himself, functions as both manual and manifesto. In it, the celebrated dancing master offers precise instructions on position, movement, and the moral dimensions of physical grace. The idea of one holding the other, Dodworth writes of the waltz, should not be too strongly entertained. To dance together in sympathetic time and motion ought to be the dominant thought. The distinction matters. A waltz is not an embrace, but a shared rhythm, a public demonstration of mutual refinement. Partners must maintain what Dodworth calls the proper distance, close enough to coordinate movements, far enough to preserve propriety. The gentleman's hand rests lightly at the lady's waist, never gripping. The lady's hand touches the gentleman's shoulder without pressure. Between their bodies, an invisible boundary must be maintained at all times. For families like the Vanderbilts, these instructions carry weight beyond the dance floor. A girl who cannot maintain proper distance in a waltz cannot be trusted to navigate the more complex social boundaries of courtship, marriage negotiation, or life in a foreign aristocracy where every gesture is observed and interpreted. The dancing lesson becomes a rehearsal for self-control, for the ability to be physically close to a man while remaining emotionally remote, available yet untouchable. Dodworth's manual also addresses parents directly, urging them to begin instruction early. With children, he argues, the effort to move gracefully fosters a desire to be gracious in manner, a formulation that links physical training directly to moral and social character. A child trained to dance beautifully will, by extension, learn to behave beautifully. The body, properly disciplined, will shape the soul. In the Marble House Ballroom that summer, during one of the family's extended Newport seasons, the music master repeats Dodworth's principles in softer, more immediate terms. "Not too close, Miss Vanderbilt," he murmurs as Consuelo practices with a hired partner, a young man from a respectable New York family engaged for these sessions. "Think of the music, not the embrace. The waltz is a conversation, not a collision." Consuelo adjusts her position, stepping fractionally backward. Through the high windows, she can hear the Atlantic surf breaking against the cliffs below the house. The sound is rhythmic, relentless, indifferent. Inside, she counts silently, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, her gloved hand resting with calculated lightness on the young man's shoulder. He is polite, correct, utterly forgettable. That is the point. These sessions are not about him. They're about her capacity to perform intimacy without feeling it, to move through a waltz as if it means nothing more than the steps themselves. The music master nods approvingly. Better. Remember, the art is in appearing to feel nothing while executing everything perfectly. Later, in her diary, one of the few spaces where her own voice occasionally surfaces, Consuelo will write a brief, enigmatic line. Practiced waltzes. I am learning to move as if I have no weight at all. The sentence could describe technique. It could also describe something else. The sensation of becoming insubstantial, a body trained to occupy space without claiming it. The rules of distance on the dance floor teach a subtler lesson. Even intimacy in this world moves within prescribed inches, and the most perfect grace is that which leaves no trace of desire or need. By autumn 1893, discussions in the Vanderbilt household turned to the question of finishing that final polish applied to wealthy daughters before their formal entry into society. Consuelo is 16, already fluent in French and competent in German, accomplished at piano and watercolor, and trained to move through a ballroom with the precision of a dancer and the reserve of a diplomat. But Alva believes something more is required. Exposure to peers of her own class, supervised socialization in an environment that combines education with social display. Various finishing schools are considered. Miss Porter's School in Farmington, Connecticut, founded in 1843 by Sarah Porter, is among the most prestigious, known for preparing daughters of wealthy families for roles as wives, mothers, and hostesses. Its curriculum emphasizes modern languages, literature, fine arts, and what school catalogs discreetly call the cultivation of refined manners. Other families send daughters to European finishing schools in Paris, Florence, or Geneva, where aristocratic connections can be cultivated directly. Though Consuelo's education remains primarily in private hands, tutors, governesses, and specialists hired directly by Alva, her trajectory parallels that of her peers, whose school records and memoirs reveal a common pattern. These institutions do not merely teach subjects, they shape identities. Girls arrive as individuals and leave as representatives of their class, trained to perform a version of femininity that is simultaneously decorative and strategic, accomplished yet never ambitious, charming yet never assertive. In her memoir, Consuelo reflects on this period with clear-eyed ambivalence. My clothes and my appearance were more important than any words I could utter. The statement is not self-pity, but observation. She has learned, through years of careful training, that her value lies in what she projects rather than what she thinks, in how she appears rather than what she might accomplish. At a small reception in Paris that autumn, the family has traveled to Europe for the season, staying at the Hôtel de Crillon and making carefully orchestrated social calls. Consuelo finds herself adjusting her gloves, not out of nervousness but calculation. She is aware, with a precision that would satisfy Alan Dodworth himself, that every movement is being evaluated. The angle of her head during conversation, the grace with which she accepts a cup of tea, the way her dress falls when she sits. She is 17 years old and already expert in the performance of being looked at. A French duchess, meeting her for the first time, remarks to Alva in Consuelo's hearing, Elle est parfaite, une poupée magnifique. A perfect doll. The comment is intended as praise. Consuelo accepts it with a slight smile, a perfect nod. Inside, she notes the word poupée, doll, something beautiful, expensive, expertly made, and entirely without agency. Education has done its work. She has not only learned the steps, but absorbed the knowledge that her body speaks louder than her voice, and that silence, performed with enough elegance, can be mistaken for consent. During the New York social season of early 1894, the city's ballrooms filled with debutantes whose names appear in the society columns of papers like the New York Times and the World. The season follows a predictable rhythm: private balls in January, charity galas in February, culminating in the Easter parade along Fifth Avenue. For families like the Vanderbilts, each event is an opportunity for display and strategic introduction, the machinery of matchmaking operating beneath a surface of waltzes and champagne. Descriptions of Gilded Age balls emphasize elaborate ritual. Printed dance cards, small booklets bound with silk cord, list the evening's dances in order. Waltz, quadrille, two-step, another waltz. Gentlemen request dances by approaching with a formal bow. A lady either extends her card or declines with a polite murmur and lowered eyes. Once a name is written on the card, the commitment is binding. To break it without cause is a serious breach of etiquette, suggesting either incompetence or something worse, a lack of self-control. Chaperonage is strict. Young women do not attend balls unescorted. Mothers or appointed guardians station themselves in chairs along the ballroom's perimeter, watching with the focused attention of generals surveying a battlefield. A girl who dances too many times with the same partner, who converses too long in a corner, who shows any sign of genuine warmth toward a gentleman. These are noted, remarked upon, and if necessary, corrected. The goal is visibility without vulnerability, charm without intimacy. White gloves are mandatory for both. Men and women part of the complex dress codes that govern formal events. Etiquette manuals insist that gloves never be removed in the ballroom. To do so would be as shocking as arriving without proper evening dress. The gloves function as a membrane, allowing touch while preventing contact, permitting the forms of intimacy while forestalling its substance. At one private ball hosted by the Astors in their Fifth Avenue ballroom, Consuelo stands beside her mother as introductions are orchestrated. She wears white silk, the color reserved for unmarried girls, with her grandmother's diamonds at her throat. A gentleman approaches, one of many that evening, whose names blur together in memory. He bows. "May I have the pleasure of the next waltz, Miss Vanderbilt?" She presents her card. He writes his name in the small space beside waltz number 4. Another piece of the evening allotted, another 3 minutes of synchronized movement with a stranger. He bows again and withdraws. Her mother nods approvingly. The mechanism functions as designed. At the end of the night, Consuelo's dance card was full, every line occupied. Her gloves are faintly marked by the pressure of so many hands guiding her through turns she has practiced 10,000 times. But her own fingers have done nothing more than trace the correct arc of each movement, holding position without gripping, touching without claiming. On the surface, the dances are shared. In practice, every step is supervised, and every waltz is part of a ledger that someone else is keeping, calculating her value in a market she has never been asked if she wishes to enter. By late 1894, letters were circulating between New York and London about eligible matches for American heiresses. Publications like Titled Americans, a list of American ladies who have married foreigners of rank, catalog these unions with the precision of stock reports, listing names, titles, dowries, and the estates that benefit from American capital. Newspaper society columns track which heiresses are traveling to Europe, which balls they attend, and which titled gentlemen are observed paying particular attention. The pattern is well established by now. British aristocrats burdened by agricultural depression and entailed estates requiring vast annual maintenance require liquid capital. American industrial families, awash in new money but excluded from the inner circles of European aristocracy, require social legitimacy. The exchange is explicit enough that matchmakers operate openly, introducing parties and negotiating terms like business agents. What is less often discussed is the position of the young women at the center of these transactions. The brides whose preferences, if they exist, are generally subordinated to family strategy. In this atmosphere, every social skill Consuelo has acquired takes on new significance. Her fluent French becomes a tool for navigating Parisian salons. Her knowledge of British peerage allows her to understand the subtle hierarchies of rank that determine seating arrangements and precedence. Her dancing, those thousands of hours of practice, demonstrates her capacity to move gracefully through the complex choreographies of aristocratic life. She is not merely accomplished, she is deployable, a finished product ready for export. She continues her lessons, but the focus shifts. Now she studies the specific customs of British court life, the deep curtsy required when presented to the Queen, the backward exit from the royal presence, the precise gradations of a dress for different ranks of nobility. A tutor explains that at royal drawing rooms, ladies wear trains 3 yards long and elaborate headdresses adorned with ostrich plumes. The choreography is more complex than any ballroom dance, and the penalties for error more severe. One does not simply stumble in front of Queen Victoria and apologize. At evening receptions, Consuelo overhears conversations between her parents and visiting British families. The talk is polite but pointed, mentions of estates, of lineages, of financial arrangements. She has learned not to react visibly, to maintain the same calm expression whether the topic is the weather or her own future marriage. Her face, like her posture, has become a carefully controlled surface. In her memoir, she will later write with devastating clarity, "I felt my person was dedicated to whatever final disposal my mother had in mind." The phrase is precise, not decision or plan, but disposal, a word suggesting property, something to be allocated or transferred. She does not protest. Protest would be futile. Instead, she continues the training, perfecting the performance of a woman who has no will of her own. At a small supper following one of the season's many balls, Consuelo writes in her diary before bed. The entry is brief, just 2 words. So tired. The gloves she wore are laid out to air by a maid, the silk smoothed, the buttons inspected for any sign of wear. They will be ready tomorrow, and she will draw them on again, and the season will continue its mechanical advance toward a conclusion that everyone but Consuelo seems to have already determined. The ballroom has become a rehearsal for something larger, not merely the next season, but a life in which every polished turn may carry the weight of a contract, and grace is the currency in which her future will be purchased. In September 1895, in the Gothic Room at Marble House, a small, richly paneled chamber designed by Richard Morris Hunt as a retreat within the larger mansion, the preparations reached their culmination. Charles Spencer Churchill, 9th Duke of Marlborough, proposes to Consuelo there in the comparative quiet of an evening at home, as she will later recall. The room's dark oak walls, its medieval tapestries, and its atmosphere of solemn formality make it, in her words, propitious to sacrifice. By the time the Duke speaks the expected words, negotiations over Consuelo's dowry have been underway for months. The terms are substantial. $2.5 million in capital stock of the Beech Creek Railroad Company, plus a guaranteed annual income of $100,000 for the Duke's lifetime. In exchange, the Marlborough family receives the influx of cash needed to maintain Blenheim Palace, the ancestral estate built in the early 18th century and requiring tens of thousands of pounds annually for upkeep. The arrangement is part of the broader pattern of transatlantic marriages that will see more than 100 American heiresses wed British peers between 1870 and 1914, collectively transferring millions in American wealth to British estates. As she listens to the Duke's formal assurances that he will make her a good husband, Consuelo's gloved hands remain folded in her lap. Later, in her memoir, she will describe the scene with a precision that stops just short of bitterness. "I was not in love with him. He was not in love with me. There was no need for sentiment. The match had been determined through correspondence, financial negotiation, and strategic calculation. This private moment in the Gothic Room merely formalizes what has already been decided in letters between lawyers, in conversations between parents, in the cold arithmetic of dowries and entails. She does not refuse. Refusal is unthinkable. Alva has made clear the consequences of disobedience, social ruin, estrangement from the family, life as an unmarried woman without independent means. And beyond personal consequences lies familial duty. The match will elevate the Vanderbilt name, securing a connection to one of Britain's most historic families. Consuelo's desires, if they exist, are irrelevant to this larger purpose. The girl trained to move flawlessly in the ballroom finds that the most important step of her life is taken for her, in a room where she hardly moves at all, only her hand shifting slightly in her lap, the gesture so small that no one watching would detect her distress. On the 6th November 1895, Crowds line Fifth Avenue outside St. Thomas's Church as Consuelo Vanderbilt, 18 years old, walked up the aisle on her father's arm to marry the Duke of Marlborough. The church is filled with 500 guests representing the pinnacle of New York and international society. Newspapers across the United States and Britain report the union in language that oscillates between romance and commerce. The wedding of the century, some call it, while others note more dryly that the ceremony represents the alliance of New World wealth and Old World title. Photographs from the day show Consuelo in an elaborate gown of white satin designed by Worth of Paris, with a 15-foot train and a veil secured by a diamond tiara. Her bridesmaids, 8 in total, chosen by Alva to form a visually balanced procession, wear matching pink satin and carry bouquets of pink roses. The visual effect is one of perfect coordination. A tableau choreographed as carefully as any ballet. What the photographs do not show, and what the newspapers do not report, is the scene earlier that morning at the Vanderbilt mansion. In serialized extracts from her memoir published decades later, Consuelo reveals that she spent the hours before the ceremony in tears and alone, having begged her mother once more to release her from the engagement. She had fallen in love with another man, Winthrop Rutherford, and pleaded to be allowed to marry him instead. Alva's response was unequivocal. Rutherford was American, merely wealthy rather than titled, and therefore unacceptable. The Marlborough match would proceed. During those final hours, a footman was posted outside Consuelo's door with instructions to admit no one, not even her governess or personal maid. She was to compose herself, dress for the ceremony, and perform her role. When she emerged, red-eyed but outwardly controlled, her mother inspected her appearance with the same critical attention she had applied to every lesson, every practice, every ball of the past 18 years. On the steps of St. Thomas's, after the ceremony, photographers capture the newly married couple. Consuelo lifts her chin in the practiced gesture taught in countless rehearsals. The same posture that once marked her as a perfect dancer now serves to keep her grief from public view. She stands utterly still, her hand resting lightly on the Duke's arm, her expression composed to blankness. The wedding is recorded in society columns as a triumph, the successful culmination of Alva's ambitions and the Vanderbilt family's rise. In Consuelo's private record, preserved in letters and memoir fragments, it reads more like the coda to a long choreography of obedience, the final performance of a script written entirely by others. By June 1897, Consuelo was Duchess of Marlborough, living at Blenheim Palace and navigating the intricate protocols of British aristocratic life. She attends court functions at Windsor Castle and Buckingham Palace, curtsying before Queen Victoria with the technique drilled into her years earlier. She hosts shooting parties and state dinners at Blenheim, managing a household staff of more than 100 and entertaining guests whose pedigrees stretch back centuries. She is presented to the Prince and Princess of Wales at garden parties and drawing rooms where the hierarchies of rank determine every aspect of behavior, from the order of entry to the permissible topics of conversation. Life is gilded, but rigidly prescribed. Her days follow a pattern set by tradition: morning correspondence, afternoon calls, evening entertainments. She dresses for dinner, even when dining alone with the Duke. She observes mourning customs for royal deaths with the precision expected of someone married to a peer. She learns to read the subtle signals of British class distinction, the minute gradations of accent and manner that separate duchesses from countesses, old families from new money, proper behavior from the faintly vulgar. In her later accounts, she describes these years with a tone that mingles admiration for British elegance with weariness at its constrictions. "I was a pawn in a game whose rules I had not written," she will reflect. The same discipline that made her admirable in New York ballrooms now renders her useful as a diplomatic asset, an ornament at state functions, a symbol of the alliance between American capital and British heritage. Simultaneously, across the Atlantic, Gilded Age extravagance reaches its apex and begins to generate its own backlash. The Bradley Martin Ball, held at the Waldorf Hotel on 10 February 1897, becomes a flashpoint. 800 guests arrive in historical costume, wearing jewels worth millions. The ballroom is transformed into a replica of Versailles, with thousands of orchids and roses imported for the occasion. Total expenditure is estimated at $369,000, approximately $11 million in today's currency. Newspapers report the spectacle with fascination and disgust. Clergymen denounce it from pulpits as evidence of moral decay. Editorials question the propriety of such display, while the nation's poor struggle. Consuelo, reading American newspapers at Blenheim, recognizes the world she has left, the same glittering ballrooms, the same obsessive attention to appearance, the same conviction that wealth and beauty can transform themselves into something eternal. But she also sees it differently now, from a distance both geographic and experiential. She has learned what such performances cost and who pays the price. Her waltzes now take place on a different stage, at Buckingham Palace, at Blenheim, at country houses where aristocrats gather to hunt and gossip and maintain the illusions of their fading power. The mechanics are familiar: perfectly judged distance from partners, faultless curtsies, careful management of conversation. In private, she begins to glimpse how the same training that made her admirable also renders her replaceable, a functionary rather than a person, a duchess rather than Consuelo. The world sees a woman whose grace seems effortless. Only her diaries, which she begins to keep with increasing candor, suggest how much effort it takes to remain so composed and how little of herself remains after each performance. In the years after 1900, as Consuelo settled into her role as Duchess of Marlborough, life at Blenheim assumed a pattern of public obligation and private constraint. She organizes charity bazaars to benefit local hospitals and schools. She visits tenants' cottages on the estate, bringing food baskets and inquiring after children's health. She serves as patroness for various philanthropic organizations, lending her name and title to causes ranging from housing reform to maternal health. The same assurance that once carried her across dance floors now helps her chair meetings, deliver speeches to committees, and navigate the complex politics of British charitable work. In her later reflections, she describes this period with characteristic ambivalence. She notes, with dry humor, that opening bazaars and giving away prizes could be successfully done by a moron, then adds that her appearance always seemed more important than any words she might speak. The observation cuts both ways. On one hand, it acknowledges the superficiality of her public role, the way her beauty and title substitute for substantive authority. On the other hand, it reveals a growing awareness that appearances in this world carry their own kind of power, and that she can deploy them strategically. During hospital visits, she begins to remove her gloves more often, shaking hands directly with patients and staff. The gesture is small but calculated. In a society structured by elaborate rituals of distance, direct touch signifies a willingness to cross boundaries. It does not eliminate hierarchy. She remains the Duchess. They remain her social inferiors. But it modulates the performance, injecting a note of human warmth into interactions that might otherwise remain purely formal. She also begins to advocate more openly for social reforms: better housing for rural workers, education for poor children, health services for mothers. Her effectiveness is limited by the constraints of her position. She has influence but not power, visibility but not autonomy. Yet she learns to use what she has. Committee work becomes a form of quiet negotiation. Charity galas become opportunities to cultivate alliances with wealthy donors. Public appearances become platforms for gently advocating reform, framed always in the language of noblesse oblige and Christian duty that makes her proposals palatable to conservative audiences. The training meant to turn her into a flawless ornament begins, almost imperceptibly, to arm her for a different kind of performance, one in which she is not merely displayed but active, not merely observed but observing, using the skills drilled into her to achieve purposes her mother never intended. By 1921, after years of increasing estrangement, Consuelo secured a legal separation and eventual divorce from the Duke of Marlborough. The process is complex, involving both British civil courts and, because she is Catholic, a petition for annulment from the Vatican. The grounds are what lawyers delicately term coercion. Her marriage was not freely chosen but imposed through psychological pressure and maternal domination. After much negotiation, the annulment is granted. On 4th July 1921, she married Jacques Balsan, a French aviator and businessman, in a quiet civil ceremony in Paris. This marriage, unlike her first, is one she chooses. She settled primarily in France, dividing her time between Paris and the Balsans' country estate, while maintaining ties to the United States. In the 1920s and 1930s, she became actively involved in suffrage and social reform movements, working alongside women like her mother, who has, in a transformation as striking as her daughter's, become a prominent advocate for women's rights. The same Alva who once forced Consuelo into an arranged marriage now campaigns for women's legal autonomy and political equality. The contradiction is never fully resolved, at least not in public records. Consuelo's memoir, The Glitter and the Gold, was published in 1952 when she was 75. In it, she offers a careful, devastating account of her early life: the discipline, the training, the steel rod, the marriage she did not want, but she does not condemn the world that shaped her with simple outrage. Instead, she dissects it, examining how systems of privilege and constraint operated, how women's bodies became sites of family ambition, and how grace itself could function as both armor and prison. She recognizes that the training gave her access to rooms where decisions were made, introduced her to people of influence and power, equipped her with social capital she later converted to other purposes. She also acknowledges that the same rituals cost her, for many years, the freedom to choose her own life, to speak in her own voice, to move through the world as something other than a spectacle designed by others. In later years, visiting Newport, she sees Marble House preserved much as it was when she lived there. Her bedroom remains almost exactly as she left it, according to tour guides. The dark paneling, the narrow windows, the writing desk. In a display case lies a pair of white kid evening gloves, their fingers faintly creased from use, attributed to a Vanderbilt ball in the 1890s. Beside them rests a dance card, names written in fading ink beside printed waltz numbers. The girl who once adjusted her gloves because she could move nothing else has, by degrees, learned to rearrange the room itself, not through grand gestures, but through the patient accumulation of small refusals, strategic accommodations, and quiet redefinitions of what her training might be used for. The film closes not in a crowded ballroom, but in a quiet gallery at Marble House in the present day. A visitor walks past vitrines displaying artifacts from the Gilded Age, monogrammed handkerchiefs, calling cards with engraved names, a sepia photograph of a ball at the Breakers. In one case lies a pair of white kid gloves, their silk lining yellowed with age, their pearl buttons still fastened. A small placard identifies them as evening gloves, circa 1895, attributed to Consuelo Vanderbilt. Outside the museum, the Atlantic surf repeats its steady rhythm against the rocks below the terrace, where Consuelo once stood during those carefully supervised summers. The sound has not changed. The house has been preserved as a monument, its rooms frozen in the moment of their greatest splendor, before the world that created them began its slow collapse. On a gallery wall hangs a portrait of Consuelo Vanderbilt painted by Paul César Helou in her early years as Duchess of Marlborough. The canvas shows her in sweeping white satin, one arm resting on a table, her posture impeccable, her expression composed into the elegant remoteness she learned to wear as protection. The technique is refined, the execution masterful. The painting presents a woman who appears to be the perfect product of her training, poised, beautiful, flawless. The camera lingers not on her face, but on the line of her arm, the way her hand rests just so, as if about to adjust a glove that is no longer there, or never was, the gesture suspended between habit and memory. No verdict is offered, no morals drawn. The image remains, a life trained to move beautifully through rooms designed by others and the small, persistent gestures by which she quietly altered the choreography, not by refusing the performance, but by learning to make it serve purposes its original designers never intended. The gloves lie in their case, the portrait hangs in its frame, and the question the film leaves unanswered, whether grace, once learned at such cost, can ever become fully one's own, or whether it remains forever what it was first intended to be, a performance, however exquisite, for the benefit of those who watch.